I'm Erin Cooper. I'm 31, the youngest in the family and the one no one ever counted. All I hoped was to be seen just once at Grandpa's will reading. But when they skipped my name entirely, I knew nothing had changed. They handed my sister everything, didn't even look at me. But then the lawyer pulled out one last envelope, and everything shifted. They didn't even glance up when I walked in. The room smelled like leather and dust, old furniture, heavy drapes that hadn't been drawn since the funeral. My shoes clicked too loudly on the hardwood like I was intruding somewhere I didn't belong. Catherine sat near the fireplace, legs crossed elegantly, a black velvet clutch resting on her lap. She was already sipping something from a delicate glass, her engagement ring catching the low light like it had something to say. Mom looked over briefly, then turned back to her phone. Dad didn't look at me at all. The only empty seat was the one at the far end of the table, away from everyone else. I took it without a word. Mr. Halpern, Grandpa's lawyer, cleared his throat. "We'll begin in a few minutes," he said, adjusting his glasses, voice soft. Formal. He looked at me for half a second, just long enough to acknowledge I existed. That was more than anyone else had done. I folded my hands on my lap and stared at the polished grain of the table. Grandpa's will. That's why we were here. After all those years, all the stories he used to tell me when I was little, the way he'd save the crust of his toast because he said it was the crunchiest part, and I liked it best, now it came down to this. A table, a lawyer, a final letter. Nobody spoke to me, not even Catherine. She just kept smiling, that smooth, practiced smile she wore in board meetings and family portraits. A week ago, we buried him. Today they were dividing what he left behind. Mom finally broke the silence. "Mr. Halpern, is there a hard copy? I prefer to read along when these things are read aloud. Helps me focus." "Of course, Mrs. Cooper," he said. He passed her a printed copy from the manila folder. Catherine leaned over, looking at it even before Mom finished unfolding the page. "Any surprises, or is this just a formality?" she asked, tone bright like champagne. I looked down at my hands. My nails were clean. I'd cut them short the night before. It had taken 3 calls from Mr. Halpern's office to confirm I was even invited. The first 2 went straight to voicemail. The third came with a clipped email and an attachment titled, "Last Will, Attendance Required." I was required, but not wanted. I didn't come for the money. God knows I didn't expect much. Not after the last few years. Not after Catherine's wedding when I wasn't invited, or Christmas last year when I sent gifts and didn't even get a reply. Still I came. Because it mattered. Because he mattered. Mr. Halpern began reading. "My name is Richard Thomas Cooper. Being of sound mind, I make this declaration as my last will and testament." I sat very still. "I leave the entirety of my coin collection along with $5,000 to my grandson, Benjamin Thomas Cooper. My cousin. He collected stamps, not coins, but he'd fake enthusiasm, I was sure. I leave my first edition books to my daughter, Linda Cooper, and my vintage wristwatches to Thomas Cooper." Mom beamed slightly. Dad nodded, still silent. "I bequeath to my eldest granddaughter, Catherine Elaine Cooper." Catherine straightened, already smiling. The red mahogany bedroom set the silver flatware passed down from my mother and $25,000 in cash. "Of course," she whispered, pleased. There was a pause. Mr. Halpern turned a page. His eyes flicked toward me, then back down. I kept my breath shallow, braced. "I also have a final letter. To be read aloud per Mr. Cooper's request. A letter, not just the legal will." Suddenly the room stilled. Catherine's smile faded by half. Even Mom stopped folding the corner of her paper. Mr. Halpern opened the envelope slowly, carefully. "I write this to the person who may not be expecting anything today," he began. The air shifted. No one moved. "I'm writing this not just as a grandfather, but as a man who's watched too many people mistake noise for worth." Mr. Halpern's voice was even, but something behind it felt heavy, like he knew what came next would not sit easily. "When I was younger, I made the mistake of thinking loyalty looked loud, that it dressed up well, sent holiday cards, and sat in the front pew. But age teaches you what silence can hide." Dad shifted in his chair. Mom's fingers paused against the paper. "This letter is for my granddaughter, Erin Cooper." My name broke the air like a thread snapping. Catherine's eyes darted to me just once. For years I've watched her show up in ways no one expected her to, quietly, without needing to be asked. She brought me soup when my hands shook too much to cook. She listened when all I needed was a voice on the other end of the line. Not because it looked good, but because it was good. I didn't move. Didn't dare. I know what the rest of you think. That she drifted away. That she didn't fight to be included. But I saw the calls go unanswered. I saw the door close on her more than once. I kept the cards she sent every year even when no one replied. I know which of you opened your arms and which of you folded them. The silence now was thick, tense. I leave my house, my shares in Cooper Timberworks, and the entirety of my estate, excluding specific items already named to Erin Cooper. The breath left my body before I could catch it. Catherine's lips parted, but no words came. Mom blinked twice, then reached for her water, knocking it slightly before steadying the glass. Dad still hadn't looked at me. Mr. Halpern didn't pause. It is my belief, he continued, that sometimes the ones we overlook are the ones we should have learned from all along. The final words of the letter she doesn't need to shout to be heard. She already owns more than any of you ever realized. Mr. Halpern folded the letter back into its envelope with precision, and for a second no one breathed. Then Mom stood sharply. Her chair scraped against the floor like a slap. This is absurd, she said, voice tight. He was confused. He was old. Everything was notarized. Mr. Halpern replied calmly. He had full mental capacity. There are medical records if anyone wishes to contest. I stayed seated, my hands still folded on my lap. I didn't look at anyone. Catherine stood too. She's not even part of the business. She's done nothing. Dad, say something. Dad finally looked at me, but he didn't speak. Not a word. The air turned cold. Not from temperature, but from the weight of it all. I slowly reached for my coat draped over the chair. Mr. Halpern gathered the papers. This concludes the reading, he said with the same formal tone he'd begun with. Nobody moved toward me. No one asked questions. They just stared, waiting for me to flinch, to explain. I didn't. I simply stood. Catherine's hand was trembling at her side, though she tried to hide it by gripping her clutch tighter. Mom's expression had hardened lips pressed in a thin line. As I turned toward the door, I heard Mr. Halpern's voice one last time. Erin, there's one more item Grandpa left for you. It's in his study. You'll find the key under the armrest of his chair. I nodded and walked out of the room without looking back. The hallway outside the office was lined with old portraits, family members I never met, or maybe just never really knew. Their eyes followed me as I walked down the corridor, each step cushioned by the thick green carpet Grandpa always said muffled too much truth. I didn't hurry. There was no need. The key was exactly where Mr. Halpern said it would be. I slid my fingers beneath the worn leather of Grandpa's reading chair and felt the cold edge of it catch against my skin. His study still smelled like cedar and pipe tobacco. Familiar. Safe. The box on his desk was small, black, and locked. I opened it with a click. Inside, a photograph yellowed slightly with time. Me and Grandpa in his backyard garden, dirt on my cheeks, a crooked flower in my hand. On the back he'd written, "Worth isn't always loud. You taught me that." Beneath the photo, a sealed envelope. I unfolded the letter slowly. You won't need to explain this to anyone. You never did. But if you ever feel doubt, remember I watched them dismiss you and I watched you rise anyway. That's strength. The quiet kind they never saw coming. Don't forget who you are. No signature. Just are. I sat there for a moment, letter in hand, surrounded by the silence he'd always preferred. No applause, no drama, just clarity. Behind me, a floorboard creaked. Catherine stood in the doorway. Still in her heels, still holding that little silver clutch like it might steady her. I didn't know he left you that much, she said. I met her gaze but didn't answer. She took a step in. It wasn't supposed to be like this. You were always, her voice caught. You never said anything. I didn't have to, I replied simply. For a moment she looked like she might cry, but she didn't. Instead, she turned and left without closing the door. I stayed a little longer. Eventually, I folded the letter again and placed it gently back into the box. The photo, too. Then I closed the lid, slipped the key into my coat pocket, and stood. Walking out, I paused at the doorway. The light from the hallway spilled in, catching the dust in soft motion. They were still in the main room. I could hear faint voices. Disbelief. Anger. Maybe even a few questions about what came next. I didn't need to be there for the answers. As I stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, a wind caught the edge of my scarf, lifting it gently. I tightened it around my neck and walked toward my car parked at the edge of the drive, half hidden by the tall oaks Grandpa never let them cut down. I didn't look back at the house, not because I was angry, because I didn't need to. The silence behind me said more than their words ever did, and that was enough. The will reading was scheduled for 1 o'clock sharp. Mr. Halpern had emphasized the punctuality. Richard Cooper hated lateness. He'd reminded us all in the invitation. Still, my parents arrived 20 minutes early, dressed in muted black, my mother's hair lacquered into place. My father silent but squared in posture. Catherine came in 10 minutes after them, all heels and perfume and calculated sadness. I arrived last. No one greeted me. They were already seated when I walked in, their voices low, the room heavy with rehearsed solemnity. Catherine's clutch was balanced on her lap. My mother didn't turn her head. My father gave me a nod, barely. I chose the seat furthest from the center. The room was a blend of old wood dust motes and tension. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with titles Grandpa had read and annotated. His absence filled the space more than his presence ever did. Mr. Halpern entered at exactly 1 o'clock, carrying a leather folio and a calm demeanor. "Thank you all for coming," he began, and the room stilled. He spoke of Grandpa's wishes, his clarity of mind, his respect for each of us, language meant to soothe, but it only sharpened the edges of what came next. The first to be named was Catherine. Catherine Cooper, Mr. Halpern said, is bequeathed a monetary gift in the amount of $6,900,000, as well as ownership of the Aspen property per Richard Cooper's will. Catherine didn't gasp. She smiled. My mother reached over and patted her hand as if it had all been expected. Maybe it had. Then Mr. Halpern looked at me. His eyes paused only briefly, but I caught it. "Erin Cooper," he said, voice steady, "is bequeathed $1. The room didn't move, but the silence screamed. $1, he repeated as a symbolic acknowledgement. I didn't speak. My face didn't change, but my hands curled in my lap, the nail of my thumb digging into my palm. My mother exhaled almost a laugh. "Well, that's clear," she murmured just loud enough. "Some children need to earn their place." Catherine leaned back. Her eyes met mine, and for a second there was almost something like regret in them, but it vanished. Mr. Halpern continued as though nothing had been said. "Thomas and Linda Cooper," he said, now addressing my parents, "are acknowledged with heartfelt appreciation for their years of service to the family estate, and will retain their residence rights until otherwise determined by the executor." Another nod, another moment of politeness. Then came the reading of the foundation assignments, philanthropic contributions, donations to the arts, medical research. Grandpa's legacy given carefully, purposefully, but nothing more for me. The $1 sat between us like a brick wall. Mr. Halpern cleared his throat. "There is one more item," he said, voice shifting. Catherine tilted her head, curious. My mother's lips thinned. Mr. Halpern slid out a sealed envelope. This was a personal letter intended for the executor's discretion. Richard Cooper asked it be read only at the end. He unfolded the paper with care, but he didn't read it yet. Instead, he glanced up. "I think it's best we take a short break." The room let out a collective breath it didn't know it had been holding. I stood slowly, the dollar still ringing in my ears. No one looked at me. No one asked how I felt. As I stepped out into the hallway, I heard Catherine behind me say, "Well, she got what she gave." No one corrected her. I kept walking. I didn't go far. Just around the corner near the small alcove with the grandfather clock. It had stopped ticking, like everything else. I leaned against the wall, letting the quiet fill me. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that follows a slap no one saw coming. My breath was steady, but my chest felt tight. Still no tears. Just stillness. The door creaked open behind me. I didn't turn. "Erin," Mr. Halpern said softly. I turned halfway. He looked uncomfortable, like he wanted to say more but couldn't. "I'm sorry," he offered. I gave him a small nod. "You don't have to be." He nodded, paused, then disappeared back into the room. When I returned, everyone was seated again. My chair hadn't moved. My dollar sat folded where I left it. Mr. Halpern cleared his throat and opened the envelope. Richard Cooper's final letter, he said, was addressed to be read aloud in this room. He held up the paper and began. "To my family," he read, "and to those I have loved, fought with, and hoped for." The room shifted. "My intentions in this will are deliberate," Mr. Halpern continued. "Each choice I made was one I stood behind, but not all truths are cleanly filed in legal clauses." A beat. Everyone listened. "I loved all my grandchildren," Mr. Halpern read, "but love like respect must sometimes walk through fire." My mother straightened in her seat. Catherine blinked slowly. "I want to speak now as Richard, not as the man who built a business, but as the man who watched from the edge as one of you was slowly pushed out." The air in the room changed. "Erin," Mr. Halpern paused again, looking at me. I saw what they didn't. "Your silence, your loyalty, your endurance." Catherine shifted uncomfortably. My mother said nothing. "You stayed when others boasted. You gave when no one was watching. You protected things no one thought worth saving." Mr. Halpern's voice was steady, but the room wasn't. "To you," the letter said, "I leave what matters most. The legacy, the shares, the control." My father inhaled audibly. My mother's head jerked slightly. Catherine froze. But Mr. Halpern kept reading. "Let them keep the houses and the titles and the party gowns. Let them hold their trophies and their photo frames." He looked up again. "But she owns what built all of it." No one said anything. Mr. Halpern folded the letter. "Effective immediately," he said, "Erin Cooper is recognized as the sole primary shareholder of the Cooper Trust and the family business entity. All relevant documents have been filed in accordance with Richard Cooper's final directives." I didn't speak. My mother's mouth opened, then closed. Catherine stood slowly. "This is a joke," she said. "This can't be real." Mr. Halpern didn't answer her. Instead, he turned to me. "There's a formal document for you to sign later today," he said. "But legally, it's already done." The walls seemed to echo him. "Done." I didn't reach for anything. I didn't look at anyone. Catherine's face was flushed. My father looked stunned, as if the math hadn't added up. And then Linda Cooper, my mother, stood up. "Daddy must have been confused," she said, not to anyone in particular. "He wouldn't do this." Mr. Halpern looked at her gently. He did. There was no rage in his tone, just certainty. My mother's hand gripped the back of the chair. For a moment I thought she might sit down again, but she didn't. Catherine whispered, "You never did anything. You were always just there." I looked at her, my voice calm. "Exactly." And that somehow shook her more. The silence that followed was heavy, not loud, not dramatic, just still. I remained seated, hands folded, legs crossed at the ankle. I didn't fidget. I didn't smile. I simply breathed. And that was enough to rattle them more than any speech I could have given. Catherine's jaw tightened as she looked at the papers in front of Mr. Halpern. "There has to be something else," she insisted, her voice now brittle. "Some clause or override." Mr. Halpern didn't flinch. "There isn't." My father Thomas finally spoke softly. "Richard always made his own decisions. It wasn't agreement exactly, but it wasn't denial either." Catherine turned to him, betrayal in her voice. "You're just going to sit there?" He looked tired. For the first time that morning, he looked older than I remembered. I didn't know he said. But I'm not surprised. It was the closest thing I'd ever heard to him choosing a side. My mother paced slowly, one palm pressing her temple. "This isn't how legacies work. Erin doesn't understand the structure. She never wanted it." I raised my eyes to hers, calm. "Doesn't mean I didn't earn it." She stopped walking. I didn't wait for a reply. I reached for the pen Mr. Halpern had laid on the folder in front of me. "Wait," Catherine snapped. I paused not because she told me to, but because I wanted to give her space to say whatever she needed. Her voice cracked. "You think this makes you better than us? You were never part of anything important." I studied her for a moment. "Maybe not to you." And then I signed. One clean stroke, then another. My signature had never felt more like a boundary than it did in that moment. Mr. Halpern nodded and turned the page toward the witness line. No one moved. Finally, he stood and signed himself. "Legally binding," he said, tucking the papers away. I stood. The room felt smaller. "I'll have someone contact you for the transition paperwork," Mr. Halpern said. "No rush, but everything's in place." I nodded. "Thank you." I turned toward the door, then paused. Catherine was still staring at the documents as if she could will them into disappearing. My mother whispered something under her breath. I didn't ask her to repeat it. As I walked out, I heard the faint scrape of a chair, a soft click of a ring hitting the table. No one followed me. Outside the office, the hallway was bright. The sun filtered through the tall windows, catching the dust in the air. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. But I did pause. In my pocket was a folded piece of paper, the $1 check they'd written me earlier. I slipped it out, ran my finger across the ink. Then I tucked it into the trash can by the elevator face down. When the elevator arrived, I stepped in alone. The doors slid shut with a soft finality. And this time, I didn't look back. The days after the will reading blurred into a quiet current of phone calls, document signings, and transition meetings. I moved through them with a stillness I hadn't realized I'd mastered until then. The estate, now legally mine, sat at the edge of the hills with its creaking floors and sun-stained curtains waiting, just like I had all those years. I didn't rush to change anything. I left the furniture untouched, the photos of Catherine's graduation still lining the mantel, even the slightly faded throw blanket Mom had knit resting on the armchair. It wasn't about removing them. It was about letting them exist in a place they no longer controlled. A week later, the formal reception to honor Grandpa's passing was held in the family estate's backyard, just as he'd written in his final instructions. That morning, I dressed simply: black blouse, wide leg slacks, hair pulled back, clean lines. Nothing loud, nothing flashy, just enough to say I'm here and I have nothing to prove. By noon, the guests had started arriving: old family friends, former business partners, distant cousins whose names I barely recalled. They greeted me with polite nods, some surprised, others already informed by headlines or whispers. The Coopers arrived last. Catherine stepped out of the car first, wearing a tailored beige coat that matched her always impeccable aesthetic. Mom followed behind, her lips thin and eyes scanning the scene. My father brought up the rear, his posture more hesitant than usual. None of them looked directly at me. I didn't wave. Mr. Halpern approached his presence calm as ever. "Everything's been arranged just the way he wanted." "Thank you," I said softly. I stood near the entrance to the garden path, a place Grandpa had once told me was his favorite view of the house. From here, you see the shape of everything he used to say, not just the bricks, the choices. The guests flowed in, murmuring their condolences and gathering in loose semicircles around the modest memorial set beneath the oak tree. Then, just as the hum of conversation was beginning to settle, Mr. Halpern raised his voice. "Before we begin, there's one final message Richard Cooper wanted shared with everyone present." Catherine's head turned sharply. My mother tensed. Mr. Halpern unfolded a single sheet of thick, cream-colored stationery. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Grandpa's. The lawyer read aloud, "To those gathered today. Legacy isn't measured in titles or expectations. It's found in integrity and patience, and in the quiet strength to stay true when others doubt you. Erin has held that strength all her life. She stood alone more times than I can count, not because she was weak, but because no one else could bear the silence she carried with such grace. That silence spoke more to me than any speech ever could. And that is why everything I built now rests with her." No one moved. The wind rustled through the leaves. My mother looked down. Catherine blinked hard, And then a slow shift happened. People began turning toward me, not with pity, not even with awe, just with acknowledgement. For the first time I was seen. No one applauded, no one whispered praise. It wasn't that kind of moment. But something changed. People who hadn't looked twice at me before now shifted slightly to make space as I walked by. A few even murmured condolences with a different weight behind them, as if reevaluating every interaction they'd ever had with me. I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I simply stood beside the oak, watching the light dapple through the branches like it had when Grandpa and I used to sit out there in silence. Catherine approached the refreshment table but barely touched anything. Her shoulders were tense and she kept glancing in my direction as if expecting me to say something, anything, but I didn't. Mom stood further off speaking quietly with one of her bridge club friends. I caught a piece of her sentence. It was a mistake. He must have... She didn't finish. I could feel their discomfort stretch out across the lawn like a taut thread. Grandpa had handed me more than an estate. He had given me the space to speak without ever needing words. Mr. Halpern moved through the crowd with ease, answering questions, directing people, never once contradicting what had just been read. He had no need. The letter spoke for itself. Later, while the guests began to disperse, I stepped inside the house. My footsteps echoed in the hallway I once tiptoed through as a child. The scent of lemonwood polish clung faintly to the air. It was quiet, familiar, mine. In the living room, the family portrait still hung above the mantel, the one taken when I was 16. I was the only one looking away from the camera in that photo. At the time, I'd been scolded for not cooperating. Now it felt like prophecy. Catherine came in behind me, her heels soft against the rug. "You knew," she said. I didn't turn. "You knew what he was going to do." I took a breath. "No," I said. "I only knew he saw me." She scoffed, quiet and bitter. "He never mentioned it. Not once." That was the point, I replied. "He didn't need to." A long silence settled between us. The kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable, just undeniable. "I was supposed to carry on his legacy," she murmured almost to herself. "Not you." Still, I didn't move. He chose differently. She looked at the portrait. "Mom's going to fight this. She can try. She will." I finally turned my voice calm. "That letter is public now. There's nothing to fight. It wasn't a loophole. It was his truth." Her mouth twitched. Whether it was anger or regret, I couldn't tell. Then she nodded barely and left the room. Mr. Halpern was waiting by the front door. "She's angry," he said quietly. "She always has been." He nodded. "But you're calm. I have no reason not to be." He handed me an envelope. "These are the original deeds and documents, as per Richard's wishes." I accepted them with both hands. "Thank you." He hesitated. "He told me something once, said you reminded him of his wife. Quiet, unshakable. That caught me off guard more than anything else had. I didn't know that I whispered. He said you both had the kind of strength that doesn't need a stage." He tipped his head, then left. I stood alone in the foyer for a long moment, envelope in hand, heart steady. Outside, the last of the guests had gone. The house was mine now, not just legally but emotionally, fully. And still I said nothing, because I didn't have to. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard. I stepped outside again, envelope still in hand, and felt the weight of it, not just the paper, but everything it meant. Not wealth, not revenge, just acknowledgement. Linda stood near the hydrangeas, plucking at a leaf absent-mindedly. She glanced up when she saw me, her expression unreadable. For a brief moment, I saw a flicker of something behind her eyes, not anger, not pride, but confusion. A mother unsure how to face the daughter she'd never expected to rise. "You always kept your head down," she said, almost like an accusation. I didn't reply. "And yet somehow you ended up with everything." I looked past her toward the old bench where Grandpa used to read. Not everything I said quietly, just what mattered to him. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. No further words came, no apology, no rebuttal, just that silence, the kind that says more than any shouting ever could. Catherine emerged with Thomas, their voices hushed, but I caught fragments. He planned this for years. She never even asked for it. And yet, here we are. Thomas's face was pale, as if the reality had finally landed. He didn't make eye contact with me. Instead, he helped Catherine into their car and they drove off without saying goodbye. I walked slowly down the gravel path toward Grandpa's favorite tree. The breeze carried the scent of grass and pine, the air thick with memory. I sat on the bench envelope beside me and leaned back. No grand declarations, no speeches, just breath, presence. I pulled out the letter again, reading Grandpa's final words in his firm looping script. To Erin. You were never loud, but you always listened. You never demanded, but you always gave. They called you quiet, I call you steady. This home and everything in it is yours, because strength, real strength, never has to shout. I folded the letter, tucked it back into the envelope, and placed it gently in my lap. The door behind me creaked open. It was Grandpa's housekeeper, Mrs. Weller, holding a small wooden box. He asked me to give this to you after everything was read, she said. I stood and took it from her hands. It was carved old and worn smooth with time. Inside, there was a photo, me and Grandpa on the front steps, lemonade in hand, both of us grinning. Beneath it, a brass key and a note to the attic. Your stories live there now. I smiled, not because I'd won, but because I'd finally been seen. Later, when I walked to my car, I moved without rush. The sky had turned golden. The house stood behind me, no longer looming but warm. As I opened the door, I paused one final look. They had all spoken over me, around me, about me, but now the silence belonged to me, and no one dared interrupt it. Sometimes the loudest things are the ones never said, a glance that lingers, a door that stays open, the way someone finally listens, really listens when they thought they never had to. And in that quiet, something shifts. Not just in the room, but in the hearts of those who thought they'd already written your ending. You don't need to raise your voice when the truth is already echoing.